Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panelists for your testimony today. This has been an interesting hearing, one that I'm sure we're going to be continuing to discuss for some time. But it is of particular importance to me and the folks in the state of Michigan. As I think both of you are aware, we have one of the largest Middle Eastern populations outside of the Middle East, is in primarily the Detroit metropolitan area. We are the home to many refugees from around the world, but particularly from the Middle East that come to the Detroit area. I've had an opportunity to work with refugee resettlement groups, with the religious community, and got to know many refugees who have come to this country who contribute to the country. They are, for the most part, I shouldn't say the most part, the refugees that I talk to are patriots. They are so excited to be in the United States because they are away from a very hazardous situation where their life was in jeopardy. And this country opened up their borders and opened up our hearts to bring them here. They are store owners, they're entrepreneurs, they're physicians, they're engineers, contributing folks to our country. And basically is what this country has been about since its founding, that we are about folks that come from around the world who want to pursue the American dream and be patriots. But I think it's also important for us, as we know that, I think a context as we're discussing this is also that we're dealing with a humanitarian crisis of proportions I don't believe we have seen since World War II. I mean, we've got literally millions of people who have been displaced from Syria, and they are displaced because thousands and thousands of Syrians were murdered. And they left because they fear for their safety, for their families and their loved ones. I was in just about 2 months ago at a Syrian refugee camp in Jordan. I had the chance to visit Zaatari, the largest refugee camp there. At the time I was there were about 85,000 individuals crammed in a camp in the desert, not far from the Syrian border, and not the best of conditions to live in. They were receiving food allowance that was equal to 50 cents a day is what they were living on. You can't buy a whole lot of food for 50 cents a day. You have one propane bottle for your family to cook from. You can't do a whole lot of cooking. But what was certainly most impactful to me was the conversations that I had with those refugees who just had a sense of hopelessness, that they had been there for a long time. You usually think you go to a refugee camp, you're there for 6 months and you're back in your country. That's not the case. These folks had been there for 4 years, a lot that I talked to, with no idea what the future held for them. And their children were there and had to work and had difficulties surviving, not getting an education. I asked them, I said, where do you want to go? I mean, obviously you're in this camp, you don't know what your future is. Where do you want to go? The United States? Do you want to go to Europe? And every one of the refugees that I had a chance to talk to, they had the same answer. They said, we just want to go home. We just want to go home. We don't want to go to a foreign country. We don't want to have another language. We don't want to do that. We just want to go home. I think everybody here, certainly everybody in this room today, if we were in that situation, we would just want to go home. So obviously the most important thing is we have to stabilize that region. We have to deal with ISIS. We've got to have a credible government there. We've got to have a strategy to make sure that folks can go back and be comfortable. But we also know in the meantime that that's going to take. It's not going to happen overnight. In the meantime, you have folks not just in Zaatari where I visited, but the millions of other folks who weren't in camps and are in Jordan. Jordan has taken on incredible responsibility, opening up and saying we are going to help these folks who are displaced, these people who are hurting, these people who are running away from the bad guys. These are folks who are running away from war. They're running away from violence and trying to find a place for peace where they can raise their children. Now, the United Nations was at that camp. I know they were looking at folks to prioritize. I want to get a sense of how we get screened. You talked about the prioritization that the UN has as to how do they determine which families should be in this program. And I think another important number, if both of you could respond to, is that my understanding is about 20,000 folks have been referred to the United States from the United Nations as potential refugees, roughly. Out of that number, I understand we have looked at about 7,000. You can correct me on these numbers, but around 7,000, and that we admitted less than 2,000. So already the UN has done some screening, prioritizing probably those who are in most need, who have been there a long time. But I'd like to know what that is, how we can continue to screen down. So I think those numbers alone show how robust the system is, and that I think we heard some folks discuss here, you know, if you're a terrorist wanting to get into this country, you're going to take the path of least resistance. I look at this process. This is far from the path of least resistance. Do you have to be in a refugee camp for a while before you're even looked at by the UN? And I mean, this is a multi-year process that folks go through, and from seeing it firsthand, it is horrible conditions that oftentimes these folks find themselves in, and there isn't anybody in this room that would want to be in that position, and they would want someone to say, we have some compassion. We know you can be a valuable contribution when you come here as well. If you could talk about that, please, the priorities and how why we've moved those numbers down so much.